Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Lora Cecere, and I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and I love to talk to supply chain leaders. This design is for the leaders that are on the go but want to be in the know. Today, Peter Bolstorff and I are going to talk about the concept of the river of demand. Peter took the class that I did in Outside-In Thinking about 3.5 years ago, and he liked the river of demand work so much that he asked me to recreate it for the ASCM conference last year. So Peter, tell the group a little bit about yourself. For most people don't need the introduction, but let's assume people haven't heard of you.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Peter Bolstorff. I'm a supply chain planning and making guy by trade, if I use the SCORE lingo. So I've been heavily involved in better planning for, several decades. Really excited to talk a little bit about I'll call it the lessons learned on outside-in planning. I know we have leveraged Lora's work, as part of the new SCORE DS model. And last year, one of the most popular self-guided tour events at ASCM, the conference last fall, was kind of the industry-specific rivers of demand. So excited to be a part of the show today, Lora.
Well, Peter, we're just wrapping up I guess it's our 9th class that we've taught on outside-in planning. We typically have 15 to 25 people that attend those classes. And slowly what I'm trying to do is help people to understand the concepts to reach the tipping point, because the concepts are, require step change in thinking, as we go to outside-in thinking. And part of that step change in thinking is thinking about demand as a flow, and not just thinking about demand as one big lump of products, but individual demand flows. And what do you think about that as a concept? And, you went through the class and you were part of the scored, redefinition, but what do you think of that concept?
Well, my big takeaways, as part of that one was demand has different inputs, and a lot of it has more to do with things that are coming in from the outside. I'll use the tributaries as an example. Oftentimes things that either go unmanaged or, are otherwise input, without real data. The concept of the listening post and being able to really prioritize what you want to include as part of your demand flow. So this whole idea around having different inputs from the outside and being able to make sense of them as it relates to how demand is shaping, right in front of you, is really a cool thing. The other thing I just wanted to lay out is this idea around forecast value add. Again, it's one thing to be able to capture all of the demand, regardless whether it's inside out, outside in, whatever. But the idea is, how do I use the data that I have to actually add value to the forecast? And I think that was one of the big takeaways, that I had from the class that we've tried to apply as part of our SCORE model itself, and then subsequent training.
A couple of things are fascinating to me that I learned through teaching this class. And as you know, I have people do homework, and the homework is really kind of a research input for me, right? Yeah, you remember that homework, right?
Yes.
And part of what I have people do is look at the forecastability of items at the item level. And, as we have gone through 3 decades of supply chain planning implementations, I have found, particularly for companies that are implementing planning as a tight integration to ERP, will often implement planning to do item or SKU level forecasting. And interestingly, as we've gotten the long tail of the supply chain with the evolution of e-commerce and proliferation of products and regional preferences, fewer and fewer products are actually forecastable at the item level. So we've gone to, an item level forecast, forgetting all the work we've done with bottoms up and tops down forecasting to be able to look at the model. And we're not really measuring forecastability. and we're not backcasting to test if we've got a good model. And so often I find that 9 out of 10 companies have actually degraded the forecast when we measure forecast value add. And interestingly, the people that have the technology that would allow them to have a report on demand for each S&OP analysis, after action review, don't turn on the report. And I just find that fascinating that we are not willing to hold ourselves accountable to the principles of demand. What do you think?
Well, I think, again, I go back to the future, right? That's the phrase I would use. Because again, a lot of the things to improve forecast value add now are things that we were trying to do, 10 years ago, as you said. I know a lot of the folks that I talk to are still not, they still don't have data that would allow them to use the full functionality of the system that they have. And one of the questions I get just, as we get into this AI world, right, is, thinking that AI is going to make this easier, better. And again, AI is just using the data that you already have, maybe faster, maybe with more intuition. But I think it goes back to the basics. The folks that I've seen actually make a dent in the forecast value add are actually going back and doing more of the fundamentals right than, layering on, icing after icing after icing. So again, good data, solid process, and then picking the right outside in factors that actually make a difference to your forecast value add.
Yeah, I think the basics are clean data, looking at forecastability, which is that coefficient of variation, and saying at what point in the hierarchy can I forecast, making a good judgment on the model. If it's not forecastable, perhaps I have to have an attribute or an attach rate model, and then backcasting to say, does this model work? And then continually refreshing it based upon what's happening. So many people implement forecasting and leave it and forget it. And I think it's funny because they're engines, right? And we'd never run our car without taking it to the shop. But people run forecast engines for years without asking, is it giving me a good answer? And it's so funny because we have hundreds and thousands of planners and we've spent, millions of dollars on forecasting technologies, but yet we are not able to really drive improvement in a lot of companies. And there's a 3-to-1 impact typically on inventory and a 5-to-1 impact on procurement cost when I don't get that forecast right. And, it may vary by company, but those are the averages. And when people talk about sustainability and waste, they never talk about demand and can better control demand, which is where I think our greatest opportunity is. Your thoughts?
No, all good. When I go back to the idea of managing demand, and I always think that's like an oxymoron.
Oh
In some
yeah, and
cases.
it's like so foreign to most people, right? It's like manage demand. I got a passive relationship with demand. It manages me.
Right.
It whips me around, right?
So the idea is putting some parameters in to say, how can I better understand, the path of demand, and then how do I take advantage of that knowledge, I guess. And that's where I guess the river of demand really helps. At what point in the river do I actually, start putting in some infrastructure so that I can better manage the flow and understand what the inputs and the outputs are. But I think that the idea is, for me, is really trying to understand, again, going back to what I've said already, is understanding what is it about the forecast that will, and at what level, can I forecast that would actually help me become a more resilient organization. And
Well, you
so,
know,
go ahead.
there are so many things that people do that just cause a lot of degradation of the forecast, right? The belief I can have a one number forecast or I can tightly couple that budget into the forecast, And one of the things I like about the river of demand is it allows you to look at the political and the organizational issues that are rocks and barriers in that river, which are often much bigger issues than the technology and cranking the engines. And, so the fact that the river of demand highlights data, looks at different streams, looks at forecastability, but also gets at this political organizational dynamic to have people have a different conversation about demand. And that's what I like about the exercise.
Well, right. And I'm a mathematician, right? So I sat in the front row in statistics, right? So
Yeah.
the so the thing I find interesting is trying to understand the history of the input. So look, we were talking about this the other day, Laura. When we think about that stability, I can't remember what the formal name is, stability index that's been published, and we've been looking at it. There's no history again when we think about it, and I don't want to go left or right on the politics, but the fact is we've got some political decisions that now everyone has to contend with, and we don't have that in our history, or at least our recent history. And so to me, when we think about resilience and understanding the demand flow, the question becomes, do I have similar events in the history, and can I put some models around that so that I at least can make sense of how this is going to affect demand, where is it going to affect demand, which then would allow me to do subsequent planning around supply, etc. So again, not weighing in one way or another on the politics of it, we now have events that have not been in our history, and the question is what do I have in my models that would at least make it look similar, and then how do I use that? And I guess those are those simple questions when we think about it. And there are organizations, as you well know, and there are people out there who are thinking about this. There's not a lot, but they are thinking about this one, and those are the ones that, again, my point of view, are going to end up on the right side market share, when we get through this.
Yeah. Well, the global supply chain was built on three assumptions: that governments would be rational, variability would be low, and logistics would always be available. And we've proven that those assumptions aren't really valid today. And so when you look at what the impact of some of the political moves are, I'd hate to be forecasting bourbon with the Canadians being the highest consumption of bourbon and they're boycotting bourbon right now, or looking at, some of the other altercations that are coming through political bias of, consumption of products. But, if we use, market data and market drivers, we can cut the latency of see the signal by 4 to 6 weeks. And, we can hopefully, align the supply chain with the market drivers. But this concept of the river of demand, if we go back to it, Peter,
Mhm.
we worked hard on those posters, and I think we did a good job. What was the feedback on it? How did people feel?
Well, so I'll give you the, kind of the during and then the after, and
Okay.
so as we thought about introducing this, I'll call it self-guided tour. And again, lots of folks, that, go to national parks or in other places, enjoy this idea around kind of learning at your own pace. And we had set up 4 or 5 industry specific illustrations of the river demand, and then audio taped it over the top of it. And I know those are still referenceable. And again, I would just have people reach out to
They're
Laura. Yeah,
they're
reach
on
out
my
to Laura.
website.
Yep.
They're on my website. We'll put it up with the LinkedIn post so people can look at the rivers of demand, because the drawings actually have the voiceover of the person that actually drew it. So, one of the issues when I do this exercise, people are always like, I'm not an artist. Okay. I'm not interested in artistic, I'm not a storyteller. Okay. We kind of took all of that out because we had a professional artist do it, and we edited some of the audio. So, we cleaned it up, but it's available on my website. I'll include the link.
And during that one, it was fascinating as again, I was creeping on some folks, and where people would move, quickly, and you could tell when they could relate immediately to an industry. Then they would kind of sink in, and then, kind of start tracing, and then, you could hear the conversation and pointing to particular tributaries coming into, or issues, in the flow. And then the other part of it, is the conversation. So again, you walk through the river of demand, and then at lunch and other places, when you'd ask people, hey, have you gone through the river of demand? Probably half the folks actually spent the time doing that. And the conversation was always back to, I could relate to this one and this one and this one. And then they could very much point to specific places in that one. So again, I think it just elevated the conversation. And I also think it made it seem doable. Somebody said, I'm not an artist, but, I could go back and do that, in my organization, if I added a couple, 3 people. So it exceeded our expectation in terms of kind of engagement.
That pleases me. We worked really hard on it. When I do the river of demand exercise with organizations and I bring people together, say a person in marketing, a person in sales, a person in R&D, a person in supply chain, a person in procurement, and I ask them to draw their view of the river of demand for their organization, I find that, it's many different views and that they've never had a conversation about managing the river of demand across the organization. Most people think about demand as I'm going to put orders or shipments into a model and crank out time phase data and measure error and bias. This concept of active management of demand and demand translation to give role-based views is a new concept for people. And, actively managing it by data and coefficient of variation for forecastability and forecast value add and backcasting to be active in managing the river of demand is also a new concept, which I find amazing because it has so much impact and it's such an opportunity for such little effort to kind of change that paradigm. So I was happy to partner with you and ASCM. And again, those are all on my website. And as we did it with this recent class, I think people had a lot of aha moment, particularly when they looked at the bullwhip effect of what
Right.
they were doing by not managing the river of demand. And we've all played the beer game and maybe we got the t-shirt and, we definitely talked about the activity, but then we go out in the real world and we're passive about demand. We tightly integrate advanced planning with ERP, which accelerates the bullwhip effect. We don't manage it and we drive waste in the supply chain. It's funny to see, funny but sad.
Yeah, you would think so how long is the bullwhip? I'm thinking we talked about the bullwhip effect when I started in supply chain back in the early 90s. We're
Yeah,
still talking about the bullwhip and,
eh,
how not communicating, properly from, roll to roll. So,
yeah, Jay Forster's work's about 5 decades old now, which first started the implementation of the concepts of the bullwhip effect. And then, we had, the work done by Ali at Stanford, and, that led to the beer game. And, now we have a lot of beer game variants. And, I tease people that, it's one thing to play the game, but it's another thing to bring it to life and really control it and measure it. And I I'm just amazed that we have the capability to measure forecast value add easily in most of the newer technologies and to measure the bullwhip effect easily in most of current technologies, but we don't do it and we don't actively manage demand. So Peter, what are your thoughts for people as we close today?
if you haven't taken the class, take it. If you haven't checked out the new SCORE DS model and the plan part of it, we did our best to take, I'll call it leading edge thinking, and the bidirectional orchestration that are part of the class, and then make it part of the actual model. So we did a good job, doing that. And I think the third thing is this is, this is not going to sound, proper, but it's not rocket science, right? So again, you go back to having good data, the right signals that or you can do math around. You can do math around adding value to your forecast, and then putting in processes and roles to be able to just do that. It's manageable. It's not one of those things that you just have to say, well, I give up. Or worse yet, turn it over to AI, because I think
Right.
that's just a craziness, waiting to happen. So
Yeah, we shouldn't AI stupidity, right? Because
garbage in,
that's,
garbage out doesn't change.
yeah, well, except we put it on steroids. Well, anyway, Peter,
Right.
thanks for joining us today. Thanks for going through the
My
class.
pleasure.
We will be offering the class again in April, May, and we'd love to have another set of people go through the class, understand the concepts of how you actively manage demand, build your river of demand, understand your bullwhip effect, and try to influence your organization. Until next time, this is Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights.